I am 74 years old, and the first time Vivian Cross ever really looked at me, she was holding a casserole dish in both hands like a shield, and telling me flatly that she had buried 2 husbands and had no intention of burying a third heartbreak. We were standing in the community room at Maple Ridge Retirement Village, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look a little more tired than they actually were, and I remember thinking that I had never in my life heard someone deliver a warning and an introduction in the same breath. I did not know yet that I would spend the better part of a year trying to prove her wrong, or that proving her wrong would mean learning to promise her something I had never promised anyone, not even my late wife Helen, not because I loved Helen less, but because Helen and I had never needed to name the thing we were both afraid of. Vivian named it before I had even learned her last name. She said, "I buried 2 husbands. I won't bury a third heartbreak." And then she set the casserole dish down on the folding table with more force than the dish deserved, and walked away before I could think of a single word to say back to her. I stood there holding an empty paper plate like a fool, and somewhere behind me I heard Frank Delgado, who had lived at Maple Ridge longer than anyone, and considered it his personal ministry to comment on everyone else's business, say, "Well, Walter, I'd call that a promising start. Let me take you back, though. Because a woman does not arrive at a warning like that without a long road behind her. And if I only told you about the casserole dish, you would not understand why it took me the better part of a year to convince her that I was serious, or why the hardest promise I ever made in my life was not the one I made to Helen at 26 years old in a church that smelled like lilies, but the one I made to Vivian Cross in a garden shed at 74, with dirt under my fingernails and my heart in my throat. So let me take you back to how a man my age ended up standing in a community room, holding an empty paper plate, and why the woman across from him had already decided love was a debt she refused to owe again. My wife Helen died 2 years before I ever met Vivian, from a stroke that took her in the space of one Tuesday afternoon while she was watering the ferns on our back porch in Millhaven, Ohio. I was inside reading the newspaper. I heard the watering can hit the concrete before I heard anything else, and by the time I got outside, she was already gone in every way that mattered, though the paramedics kept her heart going for another 6 hours out of what I have come to understand was simply procedure, not hope. I do not tell that story often, because there is nothing anyone can do with it except feel bad on my behalf, and I have never wanted to be a man other people feel bad for. But I tell it now because it explains something about the 2 years I spent alone in that house afterward, cooking meals for one, turning off lights in rooms I no longer used, and eventually admitting to my son Gregory that I could not keep up with the yard work or the property taxes or the particular kind of silence that fills a house built for 2 people and occupied by one. Gregory found Maple Ridge for me. It was a good place, as these places go. A low brick building with a courtyard garden, a dining hall that served decent food, and a community room where residents gathered for bingo, church services, and the occasional potluck that Frank Delgado insisted on calling a social, as though we were all still young enough for the word to mean something. I had been at Maple Ridge for 4 months before I ever laid eyes on Vivian Cross, because she kept to the north wing, and I kept to the south, and our paths simply did not cross except in the dining hall, where she always sat with 2 other women, Dolores and Marion, at a table near the window, laughing in a way that suggested she had decided, deliberately, to be the kind of person who laughed easily, even when life had given her ample reason not to. I noticed her before I ever spoke to her, the way you notice a person who seems to occupy a room fully instead of shrinking into the corners of it, and I asked Frank, once, in the offhand way men my age ask about women without admitting we are asking, who she was. Frank told me her name, told me she had moved in 8 months earlier from a house 2 towns over, and told me with the particular relish of a man who considers gossip a public service that she had been married twice and widowed twice, and that neither loss had come easy. The potluck where she handed me her warning was the first time I had worked up the nerve to sit anywhere near her table. I had brought a green bean casserole that my daughter-in-law had helped me make, and I set it down 2 seats away from where Vivian was arranging a tray of deviled eggs, with the kind of precision that told me she took her contributions to community potlucks seriously. And I said something forgettable, probably about the weather, and she looked at me the way you look at a stranger who has wandered too close to your table at a restaurant, polite but unmistakably assessing. I introduced myself. She told me her name was Vivian, and then, because Frank Delgado has never in his life let an awkward silence pass without commentary. He leaned over from the next table and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, Vivian, this is Walter, lost his Helen about 2 years back. Good man. Terrible cook though, so don't let him bring you anything he made himself. I remember Vivian's mouth twitching, not quite a smile, and I remember thinking that was the moment to say something clever, and instead what came out of my mouth was an honest question. I asked her how long she had lived at Maple Ridge, and she told me 8 months, and I asked if she liked it, and she said it was fine. The way people say fine when they mean it is survivable. And then, apropos of absolutely nothing I had said, she picked up her casserole dish, looked me directly in the eye, and told me that she had buried 2 husbands and had no intention of burying a third heartbreak. I did not understand in that moment that she was not talking to me specifically. I understood later that she said some version of that sentence to any man who lingered near her table longer than the time it took to load a plate. That it was less a warning aimed at me and more a policy she had developed and refined over years. The way you might develop a policy about lending money to relatives after being burned by it once too often. But I did not know that yet, standing there with my paper plate, and so I took it personally, and I spent the next several days turning it over in my mind. The way you turn over an insult you cannot quite let go of. Except it did not feel like an insult so much as a door closing on something I had not even realized I wanted to walk through. I asked Frank about her husbands, because Frank knew everything about everyone, and had never once in the 4 months I had known him shown any restraint about sharing it. Her first husband, Thomas Cross, had died at 31 in a factory accident in Dayton, leaving her a widow at 29 with 2 small children and a life insurance payout that barely covered the funeral. She had raised those children alone for 11 years before she met her second husband, Richard Alderman, a quiet accountant who Frank said had been, by every account, a genuinely good man, patient and steady in a way that seemed designed specifically to heal the wounds her first marriage's ending had left behind. She and Richard had been married for 31 years, the same number as Thomas's age when he died, which Frank pointed out with the kind of morbid arithmetic old men sometimes enjoy. Before Richard was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 3 years ago and died 8 months later, in the bedroom of the house Vivian eventually sold to move into Maple Ridge. 2 husbands, 2 very different deaths, one sudden and one slow, and in between and after them, a woman who had apparently decided that grief was not a country she intended to visit a third time. I understood the arithmetic of her fear even before I understood her. I had lost exactly 1 spouse, and it had nearly undone me. I could not imagine what it took to survive losing 2, to rebuild a life twice from the studs up, and I began to understand that her warning at the potluck was not rudeness. It was the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had learned, twice, exactly how much love costs when it is taken from you, and had decided the ledger simply did not balance anymore. For the first month after the potluck, I kept my distance, not out of hurt feelings, though there were some of those, but out of something closer to respect. I did not corner her at meals. I did not manufacture reasons to walk past her end of the building. But Maple Ridge is not a large place, and the community garden out back, where residents kept small plots for tomatoes and herbs, and the occasional stubborn rosebush, was the one shared space neither of us seemed willing to give up, and so I began seeing her there most mornings, kneeling in the dirt in a wide-brimmed hat that had clearly seen better decades, pulling weeds with the same precision she brought to arranging deviled eggs. I had inherited a garden plot from a resident who passed away shortly before I arrived, and I did not know the first thing about growing tomatoes, and I want to be honest that this ignorance was not entirely accidental. A man does not need to ask many questions about soil pH if what he actually wants is an excuse to be within speaking distance of someone. She caught me the 3rd week, crouched over my sad, leggy tomato plants, with an expression she must have found entertaining, because when she straightened up from her own plot, 2 rows over, she was almost smiling. "You're overwatering," she said, without preamble, the way she seemed to say most things. "Your leaves are curling. That's not disease, that's drowning." I told her I appreciated the diagnosis. She told me, in a tone that suggested she was deciding whether to keep talking or return to her weeding, that her first husband had grown up on a farm and taught her everything she knew about vegetables before she'd ever grown a tomato of her own, and that some knowledge, once you have it, simply stays with you no matter who taught it to you or what happened to them afterward. It was the first time she had mentioned either husband to me directly, and I understood it as a kind of test, though I did not know at the time what I was supposed to do with it, so I simply said that Helen had never been able to keep a houseplant alive to save her life, which was true, and Vivian laughed, actually laughed, a short surprised sound like she had not expected to. That laugh became the thing I found myself listening for over the following weeks. The reward at the end of some small offering I made in the garden most mornings. A question about her grandchildren. A complaint about the sprinkler system. An observation about Frank Delgado's increasingly elaborate theories about the dining hall's rotating dessert menu. She never once, in those early weeks, treated our conversations as anything other than what they appeared to be. Two neighbors killing time over tomato plants. And I did not push past that boundary, because some instinct told me that Vivian Cross had erected her walls with the same care she brought to everything else, and that a man who tried to climb them too quickly would simply be met with a faster retreat. It was Dolores, one of the two women Vivian sat with at meals, who eventually told me what I had begun to suspect on my own, which was that Vivian had turned down at least 3 other men at Maple Ridge in the 2 years before I arrived, not unkindly, but firmly, always with some version of the casserole dish warning, and that Dolores herself had stopped trying to encourage her friend toward anything resembling romance, because Vivian's answer never changed. "She's not being difficult," Dolores told me one afternoon in the dining hall, when Vivian had stepped away to refill her coffee. "She just does the math different than the rest of us. She figures she's had 2 great loves and lost both of them, and some people would call that lucky, having loved twice like that, but Vivian calls it used up. She thinks her allotment's spent." I asked Dolores if she believed that. Dolores looked at me for a long moment and said, "I believe grief tells you all kinds of things that sound true and aren't." And then Vivian came back with her coffee, and the conversation moved on to the dessert menu. But I carried what Dolores said with me for a long time afterward. 3 months into knowing her, I made the mistake of trying to say something meaningful, and it went about as poorly as these things tend to go when a man's timing outruns his courage. We were in the garden, and I had just finished telling her about Gregory's youngest, who had started calling me on video chat every Sunday to show me her drawings, and Vivian had been unusually quiet through most of it. And when I asked if something was wrong, she straightened up from her plot, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "Walter, I like our mornings out here. I want to say that plainly so there's no confusion, but I need you to understand something, because I think you're circling towards something, and I'd rather you not waste the effort." I told her I was listening. She said, "I buried 2 husbands. Not 1, 2. I know how this story goes if I let it go anywhere. It goes fine for a while, and then it goes to a hospital room, or a phone call in the middle of the night. And I do the same thing I've done twice before, which is stand at a graveside and wonder what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life. I'm 71 years old, Walter. I don't have the rest of my life left to rebuild a 3rd time. I mean that as fact, not self-pity." I did not have a clever answer for that. I only said that I understood, which was mostly true, and we finished weeding in silence, and I went back to my apartment that evening and sat with the particular loneliness of a man who has just been told, gently but unmistakably, that the door he was hoping might open has been locked on purpose, and the woman on the other side has good reasons for locking it. I want to be honest that I nearly let it end there. I am 74 years old, and I understand something about pride that I did not understand at 30, which is that pursuing a woman who has told you plainly she does not want to be pursued is not romantic. It is simply disrespectful, dressed up as devotion. So for the better part of 2 weeks, I stopped going to the garden at my usual hour. I told myself this was respect. I think it was also, if I am honest, a kind of sulking, the particular sulking of an old man who had allowed himself to hope for something and did not enjoy having that hope declined. Frank noticed, because Frank notices everything, and cornered me in the dining hall to ask why I had stopped mentioning Vivian. And when I told him what she had said in the garden, he was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for him. And then he said, "You know, Richard Alderman was my friend before he was her husband. I introduced them, actually, 30-some years ago, and I'll tell you the same thing I told her at his funeral, which she didn't want to hear then either. Loving somebody and losing somebody aren't the same math problem just because they both end in subtraction." I did not entirely understand what he meant at the time, but I turned it over enough in the following days that I came to believe it was true, and that the real cruelty being done to Vivian was not her own fear, but the notion that her fear had somehow calcified into a fact about the future rather than a memory of the past. I went back to the garden, not to plead my case, because I had decided pleading was not the right instrument for what I was trying to say, but simply because I had missed the ordinary mornings, the tomato plants, the sound of her laugh, and I told her as much, plainly, the way she had been plain with me. I said, Vivian, I'm not here to convince you of anything. I just missed you these 2 weeks, and that's worth telling you, whatever you decide to do with it. She did not answer right away. She knelt back down to her plot and pulled a weed that did not, as far as I could tell, need pulling, and after a while she said, without looking up, I missed the mornings too. That doesn't change what I told you. I said that was fair. We went back to our respective rows, and something had shifted, not into romance exactly, but into a kind of honesty that felt, at our age, more valuable than romance might have been anyway. Over the following month, the ordinary accumulated the way it does, when two people keep showing up for each other without naming what they are doing. I fixed the latch on her garden gate, which had been sticking for months. She brought me a jar of her tomato sauce, made from the plants I had nearly drowned, canned properly because she informed me a man who cannot keep tomatoes alive should not be trusted to can his own sauce. We started sitting together at dinner some evenings. Not every evening, but enough that Dolores began giving me looks across the table that I chose not to interpret aloud. And then, on an October afternoon when the light in the garden had gone that particular gold it takes on in the last hour before dusk, Vivian told me about the night Richard died. She had been sitting beside his hospital bed for 6 days by then, she said, watching him disappear a little more with each one. And on the last night, he had woken briefly, lucid in a way he had not been for days, and told her that he wanted her to promise him something. She had assumed, she said, that he was going to ask her to remarry, because that is the thing dying spouses ask, the noble unselfish thing meant to release the survivor from any obligation to grief. Instead, Richard had told her he did not want her to promise anything about the future at all, because he said promises about the future were the kind of thing the living made to feel less helpless, and they rarely held up against whatever life actually did afterward. What he asked her to promise instead, she said, her voice very steady as she told me this, was that she would not let his death become the reason she stopped living the parts of her life that had nothing to do with him. He had said, and she repeated it to me word for word, sitting in that garden with dirt still on her hands, "Don't let losing me convince you love isn't worth the risk. That's not honoring me. That's just letting my death win twice." She told me she had promised him that in the hospital room with every intention of keeping it. And then Thomas's death had already taught her the cost of loving someone deeply, and Richard's death had taught her the cost again. And somewhere in the years since, she said, the promise had quietly turned into its opposite, because grief, as Dolores had told me, tells you things that sound true and are not. I did not try to argue with her that afternoon. I only said that it sounded like Richard had understood something about her that she had perhaps forgotten about herself. And she looked at me for a long moment, her eyes bright in the gold October light, and said, "That's an unfair thing to say to a woman who's trying very hard not to fall for you, Walter." I told her I was not trying to be unfair. I was only trying to be honest, in the same plain way she had been honest with me in this same garden 3 months earlier. She did not answer that. She only reached over and rested her hand briefly on top of mine, on the handle of my trowel, and then stood up and said it was getting cold, and we should go in for dinner. And I understood that something had moved between us, even if neither of us was prepared to say what exactly or how far. The trouble started, as trouble often does, with her daughter Susan, who drove up from Columbus the following month, for what I gathered was a fairly routine visit, and left having heard from Dolores of all people that her mother had been spending an unusual amount of time with a widower from the South Wing. Susan cornered me outside the community room before I even understood there was anything to be cornered about, and I want to say plainly that I did not blame her for her caution, because I came to understand over the course of that conversation that Susan had been 11 years old when her father Thomas died, old enough to remember her mother's grief clearly, and had watched Vivian rebuild an entire life with Richard only to lose him too, and had, I think, made a private peace with the idea that her mother's remaining years would be quiet ones, uncomplicated by the kind of loss that had marked so much of her childhood. Susan asked me, without much preamble, what my intentions were, a phrase I had not heard directed at me since I was 25 years old, asking Helen's father for her hand, and something about hearing it again at 74 struck me as both absurd and entirely appropriate. I told her the truth, which was that I did not entirely know yet what my intentions were, because Vivian herself had not given either of us much room to develop any, but that whatever those intentions eventually became, I had no interest in causing her mother a third loss she was not prepared to survive, and that if anything, my hope was the opposite, that whatever time Vivian and I might have, however much or little that turned out to be, would add something to her life rather than subtract from it. Susan was quiet for a while after that, and then she said something that I have thought about often since. She said, "My mother buried my father when she was 29 and I was 11, and I remember thinking, at 11, that she would never smile again. And then Richard came along 4 years later, and she did smile again, more than I'd ever seen her smile with my father, honestly, which used to feel like a betrayal of him until I got old enough to understand it wasn't. And then Richard died, and I thought, well, that's it. Nobody gets two miracles like that. And I've spent 3 years quietly relieved that she'd stopped looking for a third, because I didn't think I could watch her lose someone again, not for her sake, and not for mine. I told her I understood that fear, because I lived with a version of it myself, the fear that loving anyone again was a bet against a house that had already collected twice. Susan looked at me for a long moment and said, "Finally, I'm not going to tell you not to. I just needed to say all that out loud to somebody who isn't my mother." I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it, because it helped me understand that Vivian's fear was not hers alone, that it had been quietly inherited and reinforced by the people who loved her most, all of them trying, in their own ways, to protect her from a pain none of them could actually prevent by protecting her from love instead. Vivian found out about the conversation with Susan within the week, because Susan, to her credit, told her mother directly rather than letting me carry the burden of the confession. And Vivian was angrier than I had seen her in the months I had known her. Not at Susan, but at the whole shape of the situation, at the sense that her life was being discussed and managed by people who loved her, but had apparently decided, without asking her, what she could and could not survive. She found me in the garden the next morning and said, without any preamble at all, "I am 71 years old, Walter, and my daughter is discussing my romantic prospects with a man I have not agreed to have romantic prospects with, and I would like you to explain to me how that happened." I told her, honestly, that I had not sought the conversation, that Susan had cornered me, and that I had simply told her the truth, which was that I did not know what my intentions were, because Vivian herself had never given either of us the chance to find out. She was quiet for a long moment, kneeling there in the dirt with her hands still, which was unusual for her, because Vivian's hands were rarely still. Then she said, "I promised Richard the first wouldn't let his death convince me. Love wasn't worth the risk. I've been breaking that promise for 3 years, and telling myself I was keeping it, because I decided being cautious was the same thing as being brave. And it isn't, is it?" I told her I did not think it was, though I said it gently, because I understood I was not entitled to any particular answer from her, only to honesty, which is the one thing I had been consistently able to offer. She looked at me for a long time after that, the kind of look that takes inventory of a person, and then she said, "I am not going to promise you forever, Walter. I've made that promise twice and watched it break twice, not because either man failed me, but because forever isn't actually a thing either of them, or I had any control over. If I do this, if I let myself do this, I need you to understand that I am not promising you a lifetime. I'm promising you whatever we actually get, which might be 5 years or 5 months, and I need you to be able to live with that math, because I have spent 3 years unable to live with any other kind." I told her that I could live with that math, and I meant it more fully than I had meant almost anything in the 2 years since Helen died, because I understood. Standing in that garden with the last of the October light falling gold across both of us, that the promise she was describing was not a smaller promise than the ones we make when we are young and certain of decades ahead of us. It was, if anything, a harder and more honest one, the kind of promise that does not pretend against the actual shape of the years remaining to people our age, but chooses the risk anyway, with clear eyes, because the alternative, the safety she had been calling caution, was really just another name for a slower kind of loss, the loss of every ordinary morning in the garden that might otherwise have been lived instead of guarded against. We did not marry quickly, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think part of what made the eventual wedding meaningful was that neither of us rushed toward it out of fear that time was short, which would have simply been the same anxiety dressed up as romance. We spent the better part of another year simply living the ordinary version of what we had already started in the garden. Dinners together most evenings, Sunday drives when the weather allowed it, the slow accumulation of small facts about each other that people who marry young usually learn in the first restless months of a relationship, and that Vivian and I were learning instead across a shared decade's worth of accumulated caution, unlearned one dinner at a time. Susan came around fully somewhere in that year, helped along, I think, by watching her mother's laugh return to something closer to what she remembered from before Thomas's death. Unguarded and frequent, the kind of laugh that had gone quiet somewhere in 3 years of grief, and did not, it turned out, require Vivian's permission to come back so much as it required an occasion worth laughing for. I proposed in the garden, because it seemed dishonest to propose anywhere else, on an afternoon almost exactly 1 year after the potluck, where she had warned me off with a casserole dish in her hands. I did not have a ring in the traditional sense, because Vivian had told me plainly, months earlier, that she did not want a new ring, that she still wore Richard's band on a chain around her neck some days, and did not intend to replace what it represented. And I had come to understand that this was not a rejection of me but an honoring of what had come before. The same way I still kept Helen's photograph on my dresser without either of us treating it as a wound between us. What I brought instead was a small hand trowel, engraved along the handle with both our names and the date, because I told her that if I could not give her forever, the least I could give her was a tool for tending whatever ordinary years we actually got together, in the dirt, which is where most of what mattered between us had happened anyway. She laughed when she saw it, the real laugh, and then she cried, and then she said yes, with the same plainness she had used to warn me off a year earlier. Except this time, the plainness was in service of the opposite conclusion. We were married the following spring in the Maple Ridge courtyard garden, among the tomato plants that had somehow survived my early ignorance and Vivian's patient correction, in a small ceremony that Frank Delgado insisted on calling a social rite, up until the moment Pastor Whitfield began the vows, at which point even Frank went quiet. Susan stood beside her mother. My son Gregory stood beside me. Dolores cried loudly enough that Marian had to hand her a second tissue halfway through the ceremony. In my vows, I did not promise Vivian forever, because we had already agreed, in that garden a year earlier, that forever was not a promise either of us was in any position to make honestly. I promised instead that whatever time we were given, I would spend it choosing her, deliberately, every ordinary morning, the way she had taught me to tend tomatoes properly, instead of drowning them with good intentions and no attention. Vivian, in her own vows, said that she had spent 3 years believing her allotment of love had been spent twice over and used up, and that I had shown her, patiently and without pushing, that love was not a ledger with a fixed balance, but a garden that kept producing as long as someone was willing to keep tending it, regardless of how many seasons had already passed. We have been married 2 years now, and I will not pretend that the fear she described in the garden that October afternoon has vanished entirely, because I do not think fear like that vanishes at our age, not when it has been earned twice over by real loss. What has changed, I think, is that the fear no longer makes the decisions for her. Some mornings she wakes before me, and I find her sitting on the edge of the bed with her hand resting lightly on my chest, checking. I understand now, without either of us needing to say it aloud, that I am still breathing, still there, still part of the math she agreed to. I do the same for her some mornings, quietly, before she wakes. We have both buried people we loved, and we both understand, in a way that people who marry young rarely have to reckon with so early, that this arrangement will very likely end again in loss, for one of us or the other, because that is simply the arithmetic of loving someone at our age. But Vivian taught me, in that garden, that the alternative to risking loss was not safety. It was simply a different and slower kind of loss. The loss of every ordinary morning that might otherwise have been lived fully, instead of guarded against out of fear of what might eventually end it. Last autumn, on the anniversary of the potluck where she first warned me off with a casserole dish, we sat together in that same garden, the cottonwoods and maples around Maple Ridge just beginning to turn, and Vivian asked me, out of nowhere, whether I regretted not listening to her warning that first day. I told her the truth, which was that I had never actually decided to ignore her warning, so much as I had decided her warning was not really about me, that it was about 2 men who came before me, and a fear that had outlived its original purpose. She was quiet for a moment, turning the little engraved trowel over in her hands the way she sometimes did when she was thinking something through. And then she said, "I buried 2 husbands, Walter. I still don't know how to promise anyone forever, and I don't think I ever will again." I told her she did not need to. I had never asked for forever. I had only asked for whatever ordinary mornings we were given, tended honestly, together, in whatever garden we happened to find ourselves in. She smiled at that, the real smile, The one Susan told me she remembered from before her father died, and said that Richard had been right after all those years ago in that hospital room, that letting his death win twice would have meant refusing every ordinary morning that came after it, and that the bravest thing she had ever done was not surviving 2 losses, but choosing, finally, to risk a third love anyway, with her eyes fully open to what it might eventually cost. I told her that was the bravest thing I had ever seen anyone do too, and I meant it, because at our age, love is never really a promise about the years ahead. It is simply a decision, renewed every ordinary morning, to keep tending the garden anyway, however many seasons we actually get.